Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to cover three topics. The first one is going to be the particular responsibilities of this particular government in power in Armenia and how decisions that were made helped lead the road to the genocide in Artsakh. The second one is going to be an update on the election of a new mayor in Yerevan. And lastly, we're going to talk about the war between Hamas and Israel and what possible impacts it could have on Armenia and the region. Let's start off with our first item, which is this government's responsibilities on the genocide in Artsakh. I think when you look at the road that led us to September 19th and the ethnic cleansing that followed the illegal invasion of Artsakh by the Aliyev regime, the road really starts with Armenia's recognition, or the Prime Minister's recognition of Artsakh as being part of Azeri territory. And that essentially, in many ways, legitimized a year's worth of aggressions that finally led to the genocide. And what was the primary mistake with that? It was not simply the recognition, it's the fact that the recognition was not married to a very specific agenda of rights and securities that needs to be backed up by the international community and actually enforced by the international community. So minus making that direct connection, yes, I will recognize that, but that needs to be immediately married to specific rights that are guaranteed, protections that are guaranteed, and set of conditions that would make it possible for people to live under international protection in Artsakh. Minus that, you will have what we have today. The other mistake was essentially primarily focusing what I call the peace agreement agenda, rather than prioritizing the securities and the rights of people in Artsakh, because no matter how you get around it, for the most part, the Artsakh issue was always been the central issue and the reason that there wasn't any peace. So the way to achieve peace was to focus on that first, rather than the secondary item of actually reaching a comprehensive peace. The peace talks, the peace agenda so-called, actually became a cover for the Baku regime to actually do what it always wanted to do, was to ethnically cleanse and commit genocide in Artsakh. And it also, more importantly, became an excuse for the West not to act, because whenever you brought up the issue of Artsakh, listen, they always said the most important thing is to have a broader peace deal, then we can deal with Artsakh, which was obviously a lie. And when you look at this particular government, there was only two options that they had in front of them that played out on September 19th and after. And one was that they were actually lied to by the West into believing that the West actually had red lines that they were enforced, that they would not allow ethnic cleansing in Artsakh, and they actually believed them. Or secondly, they never believed them, and they actually knew that this was going to be the outcome, and they just weren't honest about it. On the last 2 points on this item, I think one of the things that was quite always distressing to me was what I call the externalization of the people of Artsakh from the greater Armenian nation. I understand the legalities that went into it, recognition, rights, I understand that. But from a moral and a national perspective, this was a disgrace. These are fellow Armenians, almost all of them Armenian citizens. And it is standard behavior for any state to actually vigorously fight for the rights of its ethnic kin who live in another country. And this was obviously not done with the vigor that was necessary. In closing on this topic, one of the primary reasons that we're in this place is essentially the military weaknesses in our inability to actually help people who were stuck in Artsakh and not being protected by the Russian peacekeepers. Now, frankly, after post-220, it was not realistic for Armenia to reform its military up to par with the other side over a course of 2 or 3 years. But the reality is that this reform process, which has started far too late. Most of it started in a vigorous way post last September. It should have started in November in 2020, because if we had the ability, if our military capacities were higher, this could have actually had an impact on what happened and the results. But I think we need to have an important caveat here, is because there was a tremendous amount of interference from the Russian side, and actually encouraging us not to rearm immediately after the war. And they've actually took countless steps through the Russian generals in the Defense Department, or delivery of weapons and other things to make sure that this country is weak. In close on this topic, the Armenian government is not the primary party responsible for what happened in Artsakh. The primary responsible party is the regime in Baku and the Russians and the Western enablers who lied to us or did nothing or have no standards when it comes to war crimes against our people. However, this government does bear its responsibilities, something that it needs to acknowledge and something that it needs to apologize for. Let's move on to the second topic of the week, which is the election of a new mayor of Yerevan. This week, Tigran Armenian put together a coalition to get more than 25 votes, which was necessary to elect him as Yerevan's next mayor. Now, who is Tigran Armenian? He is the prime minister's candidate. He was the deputy prime minister. He represents the prime minister's party. And let's explain how this process actually works. In Yerevan, you don't actually vote for the person running for mayor, you vote for the party. And there's 50 council seats, and his party won 24 of those seats. So they actually needed to put together a coalition with another party. Now, this election took place right at the heart of the crisis in Artsakh, so there was very low turnout, historically low. Most people were not interested in this election with the national crises that were going on. What was interesting is there was a very clear protest vote of 20 or 25% of voters, of the ones who did show up to vote, who actually voted for what I call the third way parties, people who are not tied to the old regime or tied to the new government. It was mostly a protest vote. Armenian managed to put together a coalition of himself and a party that's led by Sarkisyan's brother, and they actually needed help from a party of this a well-known media personality named Dog, who actually created a quorum. His party created a quorum for them to actually make this vote. These are obviously very strange political coalitions and dealings. I don't even want to imagine the conversations and the deals that were made to make this happen. But given this nature of the coalition, I would suspect that this government running Yerevan could last as long as your typical Hollywood marriage. Now let's move on to the last topic of the week, which is the war between Hamas and Israel that began on Saturday. This is something that can actually shake this region. We will see how things work out over the next week or days, but it's something that's definitely going to impact us one way or the other. What is this likely to be? Anybody who conclusively says they know everything about what caused this is not being truthful. There's too many things that we don't know. But most likely this is an Iranian play. It's a shot across the bow from Iran to all the relevant political parties in the region. First and foremost, the first thing that this shatters the Israeli reputation of security and strength and humiliates them in their home front, something that no Arab army has ever been able to do. From this point on, there'll be an Israel that was prior to this Saturday and an Israel that's post this Saturday. And the most important thing is that the invincibility factor is gone, and it's been eliminated by the representatives of the Iranian government. At this point, Israel has no good choices. It essentially has two options. One is to make a deal in which eventually Hamas survives. And every time Hamas has survived, they've come back far stronger and far more powerful. They can build back up in a year or two all the forces that they have lost. Or if they actually manage to destroy all of Gaza and take it over, they'll be the proud owners of 2.3 million Palestinian refugees that will quickly and easily turn into a nightmare. Now I'm going to go over the likely messaging to each of the different powers around the world and in the region. I think to the Americans, what the message that's being sent by the Iranians is that your forces in Iraq and Syria are very vulnerable and they're there at our mercy, and we can act on them whenever we want. And it's also a likely message that they've actually passed the nuclear threshold, which they probably did a couple of months ago, i.e. they have the ability in short time period to go nuclear if they needed to. The second one, I think, is to the Turkish regime, and I think this clearly outlines the displeasure that they have of what's going on north of the border with Azerbaijan, and essentially tells them how vulnerable they are with their proxies in Iraq and Syria, which some of the Iranian proxies have been in war with, especially in Iraq for the past couple of months. But more importantly, as far as leadership in the Muslim world, Erdogan always claims to be the new Khalif of the Muslim world, but this time he's actually been humiliated by the Iranians because they're the ones who are taking on the most powerful Western proxy, and essentially they're telling the Muslim world that the real Khalifs of the Muslim world is not the blowhard in Ankara, but the guys wearing the turbans in Iran. I think to Russia, the messaging is a bit more complicated. They're essentially telling him, you screwed us out of our fighter deal because of Israeli pressure. You allow Israel to bomb our forces and proxies in Syria, where you look the other way. and you're constantly involved in these triangulation formulas with Baku, Ankara, and the Gulf Arabs, and Israel, while look at what we're doing to them, and we can blow up anything that excludes our interests. In conclusion, regardless of the morality of this thing and what we've seen, the images that we've seen are horrific. Kidnapping of old people, murder of children, and the bombing of Gaza, all of these things is a terrible thing. But in very cynical terms, this is a lesson in statecraft that's being taught to the world by the crocodiles in Tehran. Now, what does this mean for us directly? I think there's essentially two possibilities. On the positive ledger, this is something that might scare Baku and Ankara not to start any adventures against us. Or on a negative ledger, this can actually trigger a regional war, which we can get easily dragged into. Only time will tell. Thank you for joining me this week's episode of Insights.
That's plagiarized from St. Augustine, who in the City of God has a story about Alexander. His forces capture a pirate, and there's an audience between the pirate and the emperor. And he asks the pirate, "How dare you molest the seas?" And the pirate asks him, tells him, "I'm a small man with a tiny boat, so they call me a pirate. You're an emperor with a vast navy, and you molest the world, but they call you an emperor." And that's a good allegory for the world, and in particular the contemporary world. The pirates are the ones who are condemned, not the emperors. Of course, the general population is attacked by both the emperors and the pirates. So it's not that the pirate, St. Augustine is not saying that the pirate is a nice fellow. He's just saying he's a small criminal as compared with a major criminal.